Thank you, Alexis, and thank you all for joining us, and welcome to today's Institute of the Americas Energy webinar and virtual panel. And let me just, before we get going, do a quick announcement about the 23rd Annual La Jolla Conference. Hopefully everyone received some information last week. We launched a revamped website, and we're delighted to have you check that out at www.iamericas.org/La Jolla. The dates for the 23rd Annual La Jolla Conference are May 21st and 22nd of 2014. I also want to mention here as we get going that this will be our final 2013 IOA Energy Webinar program as part of our series. And I'd really like everyone online to consider supporting our 2014 webinar series as we turn the corner towards 2014, so we can keep bringing these interesting discussions and sessions to you. And to that end, Alexis will be sending some further details tomorrow when we send you the copy of this recording. So she'll send those details to you tomorrow. Well, Alexis mentioned who our panelists are, and I want to add how pleased we are to be able to have pulled this together in basically no time at all. And so I appreciate our panelists joining us from all over the hemisphere. They're actually logging in today. Luis Miguel Labardini is a partner at Mexico City consulting firm Marcos y Asociados. Marcelo Morales, who worked for a time at the in Pemex in the International Affairs Office of the Director General, is currently partner at Energía, also in Mexico City. And John Padilla is Managing Director at IPD Latin America, a strategic advisory firm that has been working for many years in Mexico. John is in Colombia now, but spent many years in Mexico City. There's no doubt, I mean, I don't want to spend much time in the way of introduction because I think everyone online today has followed the news, and there's no doubt that the last couple of weeks have huge, enormous implications for the future of the energy sector in Mexico. But something we want to get into today is not just the impact in the energy sector, but the outlook more broadly for the economy and what this reform means. So what we've done here, and this is, I have to mention something different. Usually when we do these webinars, we don't do panel discussions. We have one invited speaker who works through some slides and makes a presentation, and then we turn to Q&A. So we're going to try something a little bit different, and we're going to run this just like we would run a panel if we were in Mexico City or if we were here in the Institute itself. And that is, we're going to pose some broad framing questions to our three panelists, ask them each to make an opening statement that takes into account some of these framing questions and any other broad or major points they want to mention, and then turn to a discussion session as Alexis walked everyone through how to pose questions once we get to that point. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into our framing questions that we want to pose to our panelists today. And in terms of these questions, we'd like to begin with something we're calling next steps. And I think most folks know that yesterday the state of San Luis Potosí voted in favor of the energy reform measures and thereby providing the required 17th state legislature approval of the bill and therefore amendments to the Mexican Constitution. President Peña Nieto, I think, is expected to sign the bill into law in early 2014, and then we'll talk about the secondary laws, which will come soon thereafter. So what we want to ask our panelists here as part of this first framing question, next steps, is beyond these elements we've seen and the key pieces that have happened the last couple of weeks, we want them to talk to us and help us understand what happens next and when, and particularly in terms of this spelled out transition for Pemex and CFE, as well as topics such as the round zero bidding, other bid rounds, the new CNH, future projects, a whole litany of issues that we are going to talk about in terms of next steps. Secondly, we really would like our panelists' insights on what we're calling it's not just about oil. And in essence, we want to talk about the power sector. And what we want our panelists to consider is whether they agree that the energy reform could be as transformational, as monumental for the electric sector in Mexico as it looks to be for oil and natural gas. And we want to get their opinion as to what this will do. Will it lower prices? Will it provide more efficient electric service for Mexico's power sector? Thirdly, and as I hinted at previously, we want to talk economic impacts. We've all heard about the estimates. We know the hope for the reform in terms of economic impact are outsized. The Peña Nieto government, during their August proposal of energy reform, suggested a boost in 1% in GDP before the end of their sexennial, as well as 500,000 new jobs by the end of the sexennial in 2018. The question we want our panelists to consider today is, how quickly will the Mexican economy feel the impact of energy reform? What will it do in terms of credit rating? And specifically, what will it do in terms of 2014 and the economic growth rate next year? And then we want to look a little bit longer term and talk about what this reform means for Mexico's macroeconomic outlook and especially global competitiveness. So those are the three main issues we have posed to our panelists today. We're going to go in alphabetical order here and invite Luis Miguel Labardini to go first and have his 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll invite Marcelo and John to follow, and then the interactive question and answer session. So with that, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Luis Miguel Labardini. And thanks again, Luis, for joining us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm very glad to be here, and starting with the next steps. There is a lot to be done. Actually, I have the impression that for a lot of people, the approval by Congress of the reform was the giant step that was required to change things in Mexico. But the truth is that as far as the secondary laws and many other actions are not successfly implemented, we will not have a successful energy reform. I would expect secondary laws to be passed by the first half of year 2014. My perception is that a lot of what has to be done has already been digested by Peña Nieto's administration, and this stage will be as efficient in terms of congressional activity as the passing of the constitutional reform. But there are many other things that will have to be done in order to be prepared to receive the investment that we would expect from the reform. The reform, in general terms, is ending the monopoly of Petróleos Mexicanos both in upstream exploration and production, as well as downstream refining, petrochemicals, transportation, pipelines, storage. This would allow for other operators to enter the Mexican market, and in the case of oil, round zero would allow Pemex to keep those areas that have been pretty much have been developed by Pemex. That would be most likely all the shallow waters of the Campeche Basin, including the fields of Cantarell, Kumalop-Sap, Acatum Polchuk, and all the other fields in that area, including the fields that are under new development, such as Tzimin, Ayatzil, Tequel, and Xux. These fields are also in shallow waters, even though a little bit less shallow than the old fields such as Cantarell, and I believe that Pemex will definitely keep that area, as well as the southeastern bases, which includes the Mesozoic, the Tertiary, and the area in the states of Tabasco and Chiapas, which are wells that are more prolific and deeper than the wells in the north. I think Chicontepec is a big question mark, even though Pemex has invested a lot of resources in Chicontepec. Chicontepec has not been that successful so far. Pemex will also have to go through a transition, so just like a CFE, they will have to become, as the reform states, they will have to become productive companies. So my belief is that there will be a transition from being a parastatal decentralized entity to a company with an act of incorporation and with the framework that would allow these companies to be operational in a non-monopolistic market. There is, yes, there is a lot to be done. There is a lot to be done in that respect because Pemex is a company, for instance, Pemex is a company that it has an equity that is negative in $15 billion. And a company with such a financial statement would not be able to be viable in the long run. In the case of energy, in the case of power, the electrical sector will have new generators, and I believe that it's also a big game changer because most likely all power plants that are based on fuel oil will be defaced from the market, and they will be substituted by private generators that will be able to provide power generation using natural gas through the combined cycle technology. And this will truly bring the benefits of lower prices. And in the case of more efficient service, the grid will still be controlled by the government, not by CFE, but by the government, and the government will have to look for contractual ways to make the service more efficient. But I could not take that for granted in the reform. Regarding the economic impact, I believe that 1% of increase of GDP and 500,000 new jobs depends a lot on the implementation of the reform. If we are able to bring down the very successful shale gas and shale oil cluster that has developed in the U.S., then these figures that are foreseen by Peña Nieto's government are going to appear conservative. I believe that if shale gas and shale oil fields are developed in a way that we allow for the participation of many operators, then we truly will have an economic growth rate that surpasses the 1% in relation to this reform. Those would be my initial remarks.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I think there's a lot of, I already have a lot of questions I'd like to follow up on here, especially that last part in terms of your comments regarding the conservative estimates of economic impact. Let me, before we get into discussion, let me turn to Marcelo Morales and ask Marcelo to make some comments in an opening statement. Marcelo, please.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you? Thank you for the
Good
invitation,
afternoon.
and hi to everyone. Well, I want to start off by saying that I think that the constitutional reform that was approved is a good reform. It's a broad set of constitutional changes. It addresses, I think, what was one of the main worries, at least for me and for others, that it would be flexible enough to enable the government or the Mexican state to be able to adapt to whatever contractual modalities would be needed in order to develop the sectors, the oil and gas and the electricity sector, and I think that mission was accomplished. I think that the resulting text of these 3 articles that were modified is a good change because it allows that flexibility to adapt in the future without having to change the Constitution again. But as Luis Miguel said, the devil's in the details, and we are still to see the secondary legislation, and that is where a lot of the details, as we've discussed this time and time again, that is where we're going to see a lot of the fine print and a lot of the more specific details of how all of this is going to work. In terms of round zero, I think that the Pemex is going to have something like 120 days to demonstrate its ability to optimally exploit whatever existing fields it has under its control and it's currently exploiting, and also to successfully develop the new fields that it's been exploring and it is starting to develop, and maybe some greenfield projects additionally. So it's going to have to demonstrate that it can develop or keep developing these fields in a very efficient manner for it to be able to claim these areas in round zero. So also, there's going to be a lot of work for the executive and the legislative, because also from the day that the president signs the constitutional bill into law, is going to have to remove the public sector energy salaries from the governmental limits, for example, so that people in CFE and Pemex can earn wages maybe more similar to what energy companies, international energy companies earn. Also, is going to have to change Pemex and CFE's corporate governance and corporate structures in line with international best practices. Is going to have to create a special regime for procurement and public works for these new state productive companies, which will be Pemex upstream and CFE for transmission. And it's also going to have to create or modify at least 3 new regulatory entities. It's going to have to modify the National Center for Energy Control, which oversees the functioning of the electric grid. Is going to have to become independent, because it's now an area within the CFE. So it's going to become independent and is going to be tasked with supervising an orderly growth of the grid in the future, especially with private investment. There's going to be a new National Center for Natural Gas, which is going to oversee the natural gas pipeline grid, and is going to receive all of Pemex's natural gas pipelines. It's not really clear why it's not also going to receive and be the administrator of the CFE's natural gas pipelines. To me, that doesn't make any sense at all. But at least it's going to oversee Pemex's pipelines. Is also going to oversee the evolution of the grid. There's also going to be a national agency to supervise industrial safety and the environment. Of course, there are also going to be additions and modifications to the responsibilities of the Energy Ministry, SENER, of the Energy Regulatory Commission, the CRE, the CRE, and the National Hydrocarbon Commission, the CNH. Some of the items are not yet clear of what's going to come down the road is that given this new figure of the state productive enterprise instead of the parastatal enterprise, it is not yet clear what differences or limitations there are going to be between the upstream and the downstream, for example, in Pemex, because the upstream has been declared a state productive enterprise, and that is a different treatment. That is what the parastatal used to be considered, with this special regime that enables it to not be a monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. And now the downstream is not part of that. So now the downstream does not have, let's say, that monopoly protection, and so maybe it's not going to be under the umbrella of the new regulations for the special regimes for procurement and for public works, because these are supposedly going to be enabled for the state productive enterprises. So Pemex refining and petrochemical and gas units are maybe not going to receive this new special treatment, which is going to put them at a great disadvantage. So that's another thing that needs to be seen. It is also not clear to what extent retail markets and product pricing is going to be opened, and how it's going to be done. So that is also a big question mark, both for electricity and for petroleum products. And also, very importantly, it's not really clear yet how the regulatory frameworks and operational environments of CFE and Pemex are going to be modified and reinforced. Because, I mean, we really need to see if they're going to be allowed to compete with other companies on a level playing field, or if they're going to be at a disadvantage because of their overburdened regulation, right? So those are my comments for the first section. The second section, and electricity, it is indeed a dramatic modification, and even if private electricity generation was already allowed under some specific conditions, the generation activity is not going to be fully open to private investment, although it does remain to be seen what criteria is going to be used to define which producers will be favored by a market open to competition. So is it going to be always lowest price? Is it going to be maybe a lowest price, but there's going to be some exceptions for renewable energy, electricity generation? We don't know that yet. Also, what is the new pricing structure going to look like? Is it going to be, are the prices going to be controlled? Are they going to be controlled within certain within certain limits, but also influenced by competition? We don't know that yet. And for transmission, it's also going to be open to private investment, although it's going to be done through contracts awarded by the government. Why? Because the CFE, or somebody, in this case the CFE, does need to maintain control and control of the grid, overall control of the grid. So they decided to keep the CFE as the owner of the transmission grid, so it can so it can control the grid and control the growth of the grid, and the new additional transmission infrastructure is going to be developed jointly by CFE and private companies with contracts, long-term contracts, supposedly. So as far as the economic impact, I think that when I think about it, I divide it into sort of three phases. 2014, I think that the economic impact will be marginal or non-existent. So the short term, which is 2015 to 2016, I think there's going to be an initial impact, modest initial impact, due to new investment in upstream. It's going to start trickling in, and to new projects and additional production in downstream. I think downstream is going to have a greater economic impact in the short term. There's also going to be some new investment coming into electricity generation and transmission during that time. So the more modest impact is going to be in upstream, maybe during the short term. In the medium term, you're going to start having which is maybe 2017 to 2020, more or less. I think there's going to be a larger impact, of course, overall, and especially due to the investment ramp up in exploration and some initial deep water and unconventional activities in terms of exploration, in terms of development, and of course initial production in existing areas or in areas close to the existing production. So that is really going to start having an impact, because you're going to have more investment during those years, and you're also going to have more production, so that is going to reflect economically and in Mexico's budget overall. There's also going to be increased investment in electricity generation and transmission there. And in the long term, which might be 2020 onwards, the first results of new greenfield exploration, in shale and other areas, are going to come into the production stream, and later deep water. And there's and also starting in 2020, the new large deep water projects are going to enter their critical investment phases, which is the most capital intensive phase. And there's going to be also a larger impact due to the ramp up of investment in exploration and the further maybe investment in electricity generation using new technologies. So in oversimplified terms, just for oil and gas, I think that we could summarize the numbers as follows. If you want to sustain a level of 3 million barrels per day at a cost, let's say an average cost of $30 a barrel, just a figure that I'm making up, it would require an annual investment of around $98 billion a year. So you can compare that to what Pemex is investing in E&P currently, which is about $21 billion a year. So you really, you can see the size of the new investment coming in, right? So if this kind of sustained investment materializes, it will definitely multiply foreign direct investment into Mexico, by 3 or 4 times, and it will also, of course, substantially increase domestic investment levels. The impact of the economy, a critical aspect, which Luis Miguel also touched upon, is of course the development of shale and the ability to develop to really export or import the shale cluster experience into Mexico, which I think is going to be a bit complicated. Another very critical aspect, I think, is the amount of local content that our economy is going to be able to provide to the industry, to the growing energy industry. This is an area that's going to require very intensive and sustained support from the government and from society in general, including academia. So this also applies for job creation, for the job creation goals. As many of the new jobs that are going to be created would have to be filled by foreigners if Mexico is not able to develop the skilled workforce that it requires to transform the energy sector. So I think those would be my comments for this first round.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Marcelo. The 75 or $76 billion number is something I think we'll definitely want to come back to, especially in terms of investment, detonating investment in Mexico. But before, I think we have John Padilla has been able to join us online. John, are you there?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, we're pleased to have John Padilla with us, who's a managing director at IPD Latin America, and as I mentioned in the intro, a longtime observer and participant in Mexico's energy sector. So, John, we're still going through the opening statements, so we'd like to invite you to provide your opening remarks, and then we'll get to the questions.
Okay. Hopefully, there's not too much noise in the background, or you'll be able to hear me. No, I think, I would reiterate some of the comments that both Luis and Marcelo made. But I think, as a starting point, I think we're all kind of getting our heads around just how big of a game changer this potentially is. And as Marcelo said, well, as Luis said as well, obviously much will depend on the secondary reforms and then the implementation of what we have here. But for Mexico, I mean, this certainly is a game changer in terms of not only for the government's revenues, but for the overall economy. I think when you take a look at rating upgrade potential, my view is that we'll probably see rating agencies move from a neutral position to a positive outlook in the early part of 2014. But we won't see upgrades until there's implementation of secondary reforms, not only for energy, but also for telecommunications. And it's simply that until there's a different trajectory in terms of economic outlook for the country that is beyond the anemic 1 to 2% that Mexico is turning in for 2013, that's just not going to happen. So, the good news is that the constitutional reform was passed. It was passed in record speed. I think everybody by surprise, quite frankly, and some of the details that were included, I think, as well. But the real heavy lifting starts now. And so getting these details right is really what's going to matter. And that also includes, the Pemex restructuring. I think from a regional perspective, it puts all eyes on Mexico. Mexico now becomes the market to watch. And there'll be tremendous focus there. And when you take a look at then global markets, from the oil and gas side, it's hard to understate just how big the potential is here. Mexico is absolutely the most underexplored market in the world outside of Antarctica. And to kind of, there's every time you talk about platitudes, I mean, sometimes the details get lost. But if you take a look at the amount of drilling that Canada did in 2012, they drilled more wells in 2012 than Mexico did between 1990 and 2012. So the total number of wells in Mexico is 16,000. Plus, I mean, it's just it's vastly underexplored, and a lot of it was because you had super major fields, which are now obviously in decline and which have spurred this level of activity. But Congress was able to move energy reform through Congress and through state legislations within just over basically a week. Which was stunningly fast, and but the question now becomes, much more difficult. 2014 politically is what I would call the end of the kumbaya. Politically, we have internal party elections with the PAN and the PRD, and then there's elections that will be taking place in July, and it's going to just change the entire scope of what the political outlook looks like. So it's great that they've put in tremendous numbers of transitory provisions, etc. But we'll have to wait and see if they can still maintain that same kind of momentum. Momentum, I think, is absolutely the key word. Just a couple, other comments I would put out there. In terms of just how big, one of the framing questions here is on electricity, which has been, overlooked, and I would also throw petrochemicals in there. But if we just look at electricity, if you take the non-IPP power plants, the hydro and nuclear, that makes up about 60% of the mix. By our calculations, that puts into play roughly 21,000 megawatts of power. In other words, that's the power that is probably much more expensive and less efficient. And with an opening of the market, with the creation of SENACE, will be up for competition. That's a lot of money. The big winner here is also the government. People are talking about the lowering of residential rates. Well, that may happen, for the high-end users. But the reality is the big winner is really the government. Their current subsidies for gasoline, diesel, and electricity are to the tune of about $10 billion. That's about 1.6 of GDP. So if you say that Mexico's deficit is about 2% of GDP, it almost wipes that out. And that is a major, major objective of the administration. I think, one risk, and, hopefully we can get into this discussion, I would just kind of leave as part of my opening remarks is that there was a bit of a surprise that they eliminated the ability for Pemex to enter into joint ventures during, or basically without the bidding process of that will be undertaken by CNH and SENER. I think the risk in the short term is this is going to take time, and I mean the government has said that they're going to have this all in place in 12 months. Extremely optimistic. I mean, they've surprised us all thus far, but I mean the next stage in terms of putting an institutional framework and everything else that goes along with it. I mean, we're talking about the establishment of SENACE, Senegas, a new environmental regulator, and then creating an entire team to be able to bid out contracts. These are massive undertakings, and so I'm less optimistic that that'll happen in 2014. And as a result, what you could see is that as Pemex has to move into a productive state company, its decision making could change quite radically, and as a result, it may not be interested in producing from all the existing production assets that it has. Meaning, production could actually go down, and this is going to be, I think, a very interesting kind of transitional phase. And we'll also have to just wait and see what Pemex restructuring plan looks like, and how aggressive it is. Do they look to shed assets? Will they also look to overhaul the integrated contracts that they have out there in the market? I think a positive sign for everybody involved would be to see a major overhaul of those contracts. They have the flexibility, and they can do it if they want to. It's a question of will. And then essentially seeking to bring in operators as opposed to strictly service companies as they've essentially done to date. And that would be those would be my opening remarks.
Well, that's great, John. Thank you very much, and sorry for the little hiccup there at getting you online, but that was fantastic, especially some of the statistics and anecdotes there. It's now time to move to the Q&A, and for those of you who were online at the outset, Alexis walked through how this will work. We have on the screen here, you see a chat function, and also on the far right there it says questions. If you could click there and pose your question, I will then take them and bring them onto the screen for our panelists. You can also email some questions in, however you'd like to do it. I will start here with some questions. I'll start looking through these, but I want to just ask the entire panel. Maybe we'll go to Luis Miguel first as I look through some of the questions and get organized here. John said something I thought was very interesting in terms of momentum, and I think you've all talked about this, but he said momentum is the key word. So first, Luis Miguel, and then maybe Marcelo. How does the government of Mexico maintain momentum? That's what I'd like to start with here.
I think that's very relevant because I think the government has to move from the strategy that it took in order to pass this reform through Congress to a different mode, and this mode is going to be, I think it's going to be complicated to implement, but the government has every incentive to succeed, as it succeeded in passing reform through Congress. This mode would require the government to explain something that it did not do before, particularly in the previous months before the approval of the reform. There was very little discussion. At least there was very little discussion in the public opinion about the reform, and this is something that will have to take place, because what is about to begin now in Mexico requires the support, but it requires the active support of the different participants in the oil and gas industry, or the oil and gas industry to be. That is the only way to keep this momentum. Until now in Mexico, the discussion seems to be around whether to open or not the oil and gas industry, but nothing has been said on what Mexicans need to do in order for this reform to be successful. It's not just the government, but it also requires a commitment from the private sector, and it also requires a commitment from universities in order to come out with the shortage that, even though this is a worldwide problem, the shortage of trained personnel to fulfill the jobs that are required in the oil industry. So there are many other things aside from the approval of the secondary laws that will have to be done in order for all Mexicans to understand what are the challenges that we are facing and how are we going to cope with these challenges. It's going to be a national effort. Just to mention the case of shale oil and shale gas, the fields that have been identified are located in the states of Coahuila, Tamaulipas, and Veracruz. And these are states that are under a significant challenge from organized crime, particularly in the countryside, where precisely these wells and these operations are going to be drilled and are going to take place. So I think this is the moment for the government to share its detailed view of what reform requires, and for me that would be the best way to keep the momentum.
You want to make a quick statement about that before we get into some more specific questions?
Yes, well, this is Marcelo. I do agree with the concept that momentum is critical, but I think momentum is very important. But ultimately, I think the reform is only going to succeed in attracting foreign investment if the contractual arrangements that are put in place are attractive enough on an international basis, are competitive internationally, and that they have as few loose ends as possible, and that the whole regulatory framework and the contracts themselves are managed as much of the uncertainty as possible. So I think that is key. So there has to be a balance between momentum and depth. And also, I think the reform is only going to succeed in producing strong national companies for Mexico, CFE and Pemex, or whatever they evolve into, if there are deep changes to these companies, which are urgent and which are, it's pretty worrisome, because these are institutions that have been, are used to working in a certain way. They're very bureaucratized. They're very over-regulated, and they have learned how to survive and how to work in over-regulated environments. So there's more attention paid to regulation, to abiding by the multiple regulations, than to results. There is no incentives, neither within the salary structure nor within, the corporate ladder, so to speak, to have good results. There is the incentive is just to follow, and to not get in trouble with one of the many different audit instances that review and have oversight over Pemex and the CFE. So it's very, very difficult to change institutions, especially very large state-owned enterprises such as Pemex and CFE. So I think that momentum is important, but also the changes that have to be made within these companies are very deep. And also on the other side, the new contractual arrangements, they have to be attractive on an international level. If not, the investment is not going to come.
Well, thank you, Marcelo. Let me throw it to John. There's a specific question here that gets at something Marcelo was just saying in terms of CFE and Pemex, and there's a question about labor, and basically the question is, how does Pemex and CFE, how does the government of Mexico release Pemex and CFE from their labor contracts and unfunded pension obligations? So, John, I'll throw that one to you first.
That's a magic ball question. I think that first we're going to have to see what the Pemex restructuring looks like. I think the one thing that we've seen so far through the constitutional reform and the transitory articles is that Pemex in particular is basically being left to kind of figure things out on its own. There's not any real legacy assets that it's being given at this stage. I mean, the way that it works is that exploratory assets, they'll have 3 to 5 years, and there'll be certain targets that have to be established for them to maintain them. And then the same, well, it's not exactly the same, but with all their production assets, they keep them, and they will have to maintain certain targets of investment in terms of production, etc. The point there is that Pemex is not really being given any kind of preferential treatment per se. I mean, it does basically imply that new contracts will be in deep water and shale oil, and then that has all kinds of implications in terms of what kind of budget Pemex may have or may not have for round zero. But back on the labor question, I think that one of the big elephants in the room is what happens with these unfunded pension liabilities. You have 150,000 plus employees of Pemex, and the expectation is that there's going to be some major layoffs. But more importantly, I would actually say the reverse. I think you'll see attrition start happening as soon as secondary legislation is passed. Once people know kind of what the rules of the game are, that's when you actually start losing some of your best and brightest. It's something you see around the world. It's not anything exclusive to Pemex or exclusive to Mexico. It's a global phenomenon. So you're going to lose people, but you're not going to lose necessarily the right people. And that then becomes a massive, massive challenge. You know, I'm focusing on Pemex, but I mean CFE for different reasons has similar issues. So you know, I think that's one of the big questions, and the long-term viability of Pemex and CFE becomes a big question. And I think there's a number of PRI and PAN legislators and politicians that kind of threw up their hands after the 2008 energy reform, particularly when Pemex chose not to undertake a restructuring because it has the full authority to do so, and it didn't do it. So this is a wake-up call, and the question, the first thing that we'll be looking for, the first signpost, will be what is the restructuring and how aggressive is it? Because now that you've taken the 5 union board members off of the Pemex board, that has a couple of implications. One is, are you now going to put people that are much more technically capable as the independent board members as part of the overall board? And what does that do in terms of the decision making for Pemex? And I think that will all start to be seen very, very early in 2014. But that's not to say that we'll see a restructuring in the first half of the year, but maybe we will. I hope so.
Jump straight to take that answer and then go to something, Marcelo. There's a question here about Round Zero specific. I think it's a follow-on to some of the things John talked about. And the question is, what incentives will Pemex have to be realistic in terms of its operational financial capabilities during Round Zero? So that's a question. You know, I think the timeline is spelled out when Pemex and when these things get defined for Round Zero. But what are the incentives, and what is incentivizing Pemex to be realistic, I guess, is the question here.
This is Marcelo. I don't know that Pemex is going to have any incentives to be realistic, but I think I would look at it the other way. I think that the regulator is going to be responsible for reviewing Pemex's capabilities in terms of budget, in terms of project execution, and determining. I mean, I think Pemex is going to do what it needs to do is raise their hand and say, hey, I want it all. I want everything from Round Zero, and the regulator is going to have to be the one who's going to have to make a very thorough analysis and be very realistic and say, look, in budgetary terms, for example, well, based on your budget for this year or past 5 years or whatever, and that is also complicated because there is no, the problem here is that Pemex has no budget autonomy yet, full budget autonomy. So Pemex cannot say, well, I have this budget, for the next 5 years or for the next 10 years, because the budget is voted on every year by Congress as part of the federal budget. So that makes things much more complicated for the regulator, because what is the size of Pemex's budget for the next 5 years is completely subjective. So I think it is going to be a complicated task, but I think that Pemex has absolutely no incentive to moderate their ambitions, so to speak, for Round Zero.
So it speaks to, again, some of the points all of you made in terms of nailing down the secondary legislation in terms of what the role of CNH and SENER going forward. Thanks, Marcel. Let me ask Luis. There's a lot of questions here about some of the language and some of the things spelled out, the transition from parastatal to productive state companies. So let me ask you, Luis Miguel. I think again this is sort of in line with some of the things we're talking about. The question is, what does productive state companies mean, and how is it different from the status quo? I think we're talking about Pemex a little bit just now, but maybe you could also throw CFE into this in terms of your answer.
Okay. Well, the reform that was passed, it doesn't define the concept productive company, but my expectation would be for these companies to be real companies, the reform that was passed back in 2008 was a reform that tried to improve corporate governance in Pemex. And by saying that, what I'm trying to mean is that this time I would expect Pemex to fulfill its role as a company that performs operations, exploration and production and downstream operations, and obtains a revenue and makes a rate of return on its investment. Until now, there has been a confusion between Pemex as the monopoly that somehow represents the rights of Mexicans, rights of ownership to the oil and gas that is underground, and that has never been the case. Actually, if you take a look at Pemex financial statements, oil and gas reserves do not belong to Pemex, but are in other accounts because it belongs to the state. So what I would expect from a productive company would be a true company with a board of directors that does represent the interest of stockholders, even though the only stockholder is the government of Mexico. But the objective of this company is to make money from as a result of its operations of extracting, producing, and processing gas and crude oil. That's what I would expect from a productive state company. And the challenge for Pemex is huge because it would have to move very fast in order to be competitive in an open market. Pemex has had the advantage of being the monopoly and has had this advantage of this confusion of Pemex being the operator, but at the same time somehow represent the interest or of the owner of the resource. So I think this reform clearly separates the government as the representative of the interest of the owner of the reserves, and Pemex as an operating company, not the operating company anymore, but one of the operating companies, perhaps the national oil company, as it has been developed in other countries such as Brazil or Colombia or Norway. But Pemex will be an operating company, and it will not have anymore the authority that it has had in the past in relation to oil and gas reserves, and it won't have this supra company regulatory authority that somehow Pemex has had for a long time. So what I would expect and what I would like to see in the future is eventually Pemex shares being offered in an IPO, because that really would mean that Pemex has made the full transition from being a state-owned company, a decentralized organism, as it is legally known, and move into being a true company such as the other national oil companies that we see around the world.
That's great. Thank you. I just realized it's already 2 o'clock, so we've got all kinds of questions that I'd like to keep trying to get to if our panelists are willing, and everyone who wants to stay online, we'll keep moving here. So I want to turn to, there's, as everyone would guess, a lot of questions about shale specifically and what the reform may mean for shale. I'm going to try and bundle some of these together, and I'll throw it to John first. Putting some of these things together, John, there's questions about technology transfer, how the U.S. model, how companies in the U.S. can pass the knowledge to Pemex. How can Pemex gain that knowledge from the U.S. experience? A secondary part, or a second part of the question would be, will there really be any shale gas or shale oil developed before 2018? And on top of all of this, I'd like to see what your thoughts are about the impact of the abundance of natural gas in the United States market, and what does that mean in terms of incentivizing or disincentivizing the short term for shale in Mexico? So maybe John first, and then if anyone else wants to jump in.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Give us your thoughts as to what is going to happen with shale, and will it happen before 2018, and what does the U.S. impact mean?
Yeah, okay. I think there's a couple of comments. I mean, everybody's focused on Pemex, but I'm not sure that Pemex is really going to. I mean, we'll see if Pemex is going to be the entity. They would certainly be interested in being involved, but I think the bigger player is all of the Mexican conglomerates and Mexican families. There's billions of dollars on the sidelines in Mexico, and part of the reform, a good part of the last push of the reform came from precisely those individuals through business chambers as well as individually. And it's basically because they know that there's limited opportunities for them to play in the deep water space, and where they're going to play is in their backyard onshore, and that's going to be unconventionals. So my expectation would be that you're going to see, and you're already seeing a number of these companies both buying assets as well as kind of traipsing around Houston, Dallas, etc., looking to, come up to speed on what the opportunity set is. I think overall it will very much depend, and it ties into exactly what I was just saying. I mean, they knew that production sharing or profit sharing wasn't going to get it done. Certainly profit sharing wasn't going to get it done, and that they needed to at least be on par with what is offered up in the U.S., and that means licenses. So, or concessions. I mean, I think we're still bantering with language. Spanish is a very rich language, and we'll see exactly how they tiptoe through the difference between a license and a concession, and then what that means in terms of constitutional controversies, etc. But that's a whole different topic. I think the point is that there's tremendous interest on the Mexico side. Mexico has very significant reserves, top 5, top 10 potential, but potential really doesn't mean anything until we get into the ground and start drilling and proving up reserves. And I think that that could be a big boom. Clearly, there's challenges. There's there's infrastructure challenges. There's water usage challenges. Particularly in the north, but I mean, I hail from Colorado, and water is very sacred, and you see that a number of the players are putting cleaner water back into the system than what they took out. So I mean, there's a lot of education, and I mean, as per Luis's comments, education does have to happen at some point, because I mean, you already have, I think it's something called the Mexican Alliance against fracking that's already been established, and they're starting to lobby, etc. The point is that there's lots of opportunity, but the next steps will really matter in terms of what's involved in what's included in the contracts, and what kind of educational process is taking place to essentially help smooth the way to eliminate some of the taboos that clearly are, continue to plague an industry that is still very much in its infancy. So I think that's those are the comments. Pemex, we'll see. I think there's a big question of whether Pemex should be operating in shale gas, shale oil reserves. Much more expensive stuff, and they've got many more assets that are low-cost production assets. They're just less sexy. The question here is, do you want to be sexy or do you want to be profitable?
Well, shoot, with that transition question, Marcelo, I'm going to throw it to you and ask you first to repeat something you mentioned, and then I'll get into your thoughts on sexy versus productive. There's a question, Marcelo. Could you repeat the numbers you set forth in terms of, you did an analysis on I think it was a $30 barrel, and how much? I think it was 98 billion. But first, repeat those numbers you put forth during your opening remarks, and then a specific question I think that ties very much into what John just said at the outset of his answer in terms of Mexican money that's looking to flow into this sector. And could you, Marcelo, speak to what Mexican companies can we think of in terms of becoming oil-producing companies in the future in Mexico under the new energy reality?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, the numbers are just some. I mean, I was just crunching some numbers today, and basically what I was calculating is if you are going to maintain the production platform of 3 million barrels per day. So that's 3 million barrels per day every day of the year, 365 days of the year, at a cost of $30, which is not Pemex's current overall cost. But if we take the new areas, the cost of the new areas, or the cost of the additional barrels that are coming on stream, it should be around $25 to $30. Then you would need to invest approximately, what the figure I came up with was $98 billion a year, so almost $100 billion a year. That is what you would need, because on one hand you're producing 500,000 barrels more than you are producing right now, but on the other hand, the cost of each additional barrel is going to be, I mean, the cost of producing, maintaining the 2.5 million barrel production platform is going to be much higher each day. So that's why you would need that around 100 billion figure in order to maintain a 3 million barrel per day production, in the years to come. So that's just a figure that I was throwing around, and you can compare that with the 20 to 22 billion dollars that Pemex E&P is investing right now. So it's basically, you would require $80 billion in additional investment, which is huge right. for Mexico. So that was that. In terms of the shale, the opportunities in shale and the being sexy versus being productive, well, first I have a small disagreement with John, because I don't think that the Mexican legislators were trying to bring our constitution in par with the opportunities that there are in the U.S., because the U.S. has something that Mexico is never going to have. Well, never say never, but and that very, very few countries have, is that the owner of the land is the owner of what's underneath, the underground resources. So here we have that very, very big difference, which is very significant, and which has in large part been responsible for enabling the development and the shale boom in the U.S. What I would basically boil it down to, whether there's going to be shale production, shale gas and oil production in Mexico or not, by 2018, I would boil it down mainly, I mean, there's many other factors, to two things. One, what is the price of gas, and what is the price of oil? Two, well, and of course, what is the cost of producing in those areas? And two, what is a mix of gas and oil, and especially natural gas liquids, in especially the extension of Eagle Ford south of the border, which is the area of most immediate focus, so to speak. So if you have a lot of dry gas, and gas prices are stuck at $3.5 to $4 per million BTU, I don't think you're going to have much development. I mean, be it Pemex, be it anybody, you're not going to have a lot of development, because it's not going to be economically viable. If you have a lot of natural gas liquids, on the other hand, then it could be interesting. And for shale oil, it will also depend on the price of oil and the cost. So I think it's going to be much more market driven, with the exception of course, what type of contracts the government is going to be able to put out, and whether those contracts are going to be attractive or not. So I think that is basically what's going to drive shale production in Mexico in the coming years.
Real quickly, the question about John talked about the money that was going to go into the sector. What are some of the companies? Do you have any idea? Could you speak a little bit, any definition as to who are the new players going to be?
Well, I think that, I mean, without mentioning names, I think that there are companies, there are services companies, Mexican services companies, which have been providing services, oil field services to Pemex for many years, which are all are scrambling, and they're all very active. They've all been very active for the last year, and especially the past 6 months. Very, very active in trying to hook up with partners, with foreign companies that have technology, and with other companies, so that they can eventually evolve into oil field operators, into operators from services companies. So that is So you have a range of companies. There are a host of companies that provide onshore and offshore services to Pemex, have traditionally provided them. So those are candidates to go into E&P for sure. You also have, you know, other Mexican companies that are, you know, they specialize, for example, in transport. You know, so they could go into transport, the transport of fuels, which was transport and storage of fuels. You know, you have shipping companies in Mexico. So in downstream and in the midstream, you could have a lot of, you're going to have a lot of interest and a lot of activity in Mexican companies. Some of them, you know, partnering amongst themselves. Some of them trying to go alone for smaller projects, and some of them trying to bring partners from abroad for know-how, technology, and capital. So I think that there are indeed a lot of companies. I mean, we've seen the interest as a consulting company. There was a very definite change between the clients we had prior to 2013, which were 90% foreign companies wanting to enter Mexico, and starting in 2013, we've had a lot of Mexican companies come up to us and say, "Hey, what can I do? Help me understand the reform and help me understand what new opportunities I have because of the reform." So there's a lot of companies, you know, and there's, for example, manufacturing companies that use petrochemicals for their manufacturing processes that are now looking to go upstream. They're turning around and they're saying, maybe I can partner up with an American company or with a foreign company, and I can start a petrochemical complex, or I can you know, partner up with Pemex and do this and do that. So there's really a lot of activity all over the sector, and for electricity it's just the same. So there are billions and billions, as John said, of capital. These companies are you know, and these are mostly, a lot of them are family-owned companies, and these are families are very, very rich, and they have a long tradition of being in a sector or just out or on the outskirts of the sector, so to speak. And all these companies are really opening their eyes right now, and they're very active in trying to reinvent themselves and trying to evolve with Mexico's energy sector.
Excellent. Let's we got a few more minutes and then we've got to wrap up. I know we sort of went over here, but I appreciate everyone hanging out. Luis Miguel, let's go back to sort of next steps. There's a couple of questions I'll put together here for you. And there's a question, one part is if you could help explain a little bit more in terms of the future relationship between CNR and the Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, the CNH, in terms of their responsibilities for future bid rounds. And a secondary question related, and I think would be interesting here for Luis Miguel and then John and Marcelo as well, what areas should or could the government start bidding out that would allow them to really show some results in terms of investment and perhaps even production volumes? I guess sort of like, what should the government do, and I would call it to put points on the board in terms of showing the reform is really working. So Luis Miguel, first to you, and then we'll go to John and Marcelo, and maybe we'll have time for one question after that to wrap everything up. Luis, are you there? Yep. Okay.
Can you
Gotcha.
hear me? Yes, I'm here. Can
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay. I think the government has every incentive to offer results as soon as possible, precisely because of the issues that have been mentioned here. Keeping the momentum is not going to be easy. All the political capital of this administration has been put in the energy reform, and other reforms were sacrificed in order to have this energy reform have a successful approval in the chambers. So I truly believe that the government is going to try to move very fast. The government is going to try to being fair, to understand the international market in order to put out contracts that are competitive with other countries in terms of attracting investment in the E&P sector. Having said so, there is a lot to be done regarding the role of the National Hydrocarbons Commission, the CNH, because it was not the CNH was not given clear autonomy. It is still dependent on CENER, but it seems that the National Hydrocarbons Commission is going to be extensively used to conduct the bidding rounds. And even though CENER will still have a control on the CNH will have the responsibility. I really would have liked to see an autonomous CNH as in the same fashion as the Central Bank of Mexico, the Banco de Mexico. Unfortunately, that was not the case. But I really would have liked to see that, because in other countries, the Hydrocarbons Commission is the appointed representative of the interests of the state in the oil and gas that is in the subsoil, and their assignment, their mandate, their only mandate is to maximize the value of those resources. Having CENER still controls CNH at least has the potential of bringing politics into a decision-making process that would have to be completely autonomous from the role of the state. So just to round up the answer, the government has every incentive to put together the new structures and the new organization in order to start putting out the tenders and attract investment and have investment start producing results as soon as possible. That would only be the case if the government has already advanced significantly in what are the next steps in the near future.
I think we lost you, Luis Miguel. All right, I'm going to have to, I'm not sure, I think we lost the connection with Luis Miguel Labardini, so sorry about that. Let's move to, well, John, let me first ask John or Marcelo if you guys want to throw in any comments on that before we pose sort of a wrap-up question. Any thoughts on the relationship between CENER and CNH and you know, putting points on the board? John, if you want to go first.
Sure, a couple comments. Yeah, I mean, I think that with the way that this is shaping up in terms of Pemex keeping all of its exploration and production assets initially, as I said in some of my initial comments, it really kind of leaves you with deep water and unconventionals, both of which will pose challenges to get out of the starting blocks very quickly. And so what I would say is that I think that, you know, the newly comprised or newly configured Pemex board, and particularly the state representatives and perhaps the independent representatives, you know,
John? Well, I think we, boy, this is, okay, I guess that's a signal that we need to wrap up. Marcelo, hopefully you're still online and you can take a stab at this series of questions we're kicking around and see if we can get John and Luis Miguel back on to wrap up here. Marcelo?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's not much to add. I mean, I think in terms of the CNH and CENER, you know, the relationship is going to be very interesting. It's going to be also very critical. Is, you know, as was already said, the administration and the PRI and also the PAN, which supported this wholeheartedly, of course, they all have, you know, all the incentives to have results come up as soon as possible. So the one thing that I'm going to say is that in this new relationship between CNET and CNH, which, in which the details, many of the details are yet to be defined. What's going to be very important is not to have rivalry between the regulators, so to speak. I mean, we need to ensure that the system runs as smoothly as possible, that they both complement each other, that they work together, and that they don't start, having factious rivalries and they start competing for power. And why? Because that is going to be the only loser in that. It's going to be the companies that are trying to invest, and of course the sector. So I think that is just a very overall objective to keep in mind, that as we multiply regulators, we cannot afford to multiply bureaucracy and to multiply red tape. That is like a double mission that is very important as this second part of the reform is materializing, which is the institutional part, and the regulatory part is that we need to multiply regulatory entities, but we need to cut red tape as much as possible. So I think that would be my concluding thought on this.
Much, Marcelo. And John or Luis Miguel, we'll wrap up here. If you've been able to get back online, let me know.
Yes.
Otherwise, oh, wonderful. All right, John. How about? Sorry about that. Why don't you finish your thoughts there on the new regulatory outlook?
Okay, I don't know if you caught any of what I said, but I was saying that the definition of the productive state company, the laws that need to be established, that will then define, I think, in many respects, some of the marching orders that Pemex will have as it will be a state company in terms of efficiency, in particular, and then if it needs to be profitable and how profit is defined. I think the point here is that the way that the constitutional reform has been put forward, it essentially keeps all of the exploration and production assets on the sidelines, and by definition that essentially leaves only deep water and unconventionals, to a large degree as the assets that will move forward, both of which will have difficulties getting out of the starting gate or getting those kind of quick points on the board. So what I would say is that one, we'll want to see what the definition and what the laws are of the productive state company, and then the newly configured Pemex board can put some pressure on Pemex to potentially relinquish assets that are not necessarily the creme de la creme in its production basket, so that the state can bid out those blocks to get some quick production. The last thing that I would just mention is that, on autonomy, I mean, I think it's been a big discussion point, and I would just say that whether CNH and CRE are autonomous or not, it's really not a question of autonomy. It's a question of whether they have the resources, which they have not had, and the new reform does that. And the second thing is enforcement. Enforcement is still something that's not completely clear, and I think some of it will have to wait and see what is included in some of the secondary legislation. That will be critical to see, exactly how much power these guys have to really do the things that they need to do, and not be just strictly dependent on Secretary of Energy.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. We're gone over time, and unfortunately, we've lost the connection with Luis Miguel Labardini. But we've got a lot more questions here, but I don't want to keep people. We said this would wrap, so we'll have to wrap up. But I want to thank John Padilla, Marcelo Morales, as well as Luis Miguel Labardini, who unfortunately won't be hearing me thank him because his signal is lost. I should let everyone know that we had folks dialing in from all over. Literally, Luis Miguel is in Brazil, John is in Colombia, and Marcelo is in Mexico City. So given all of those connections and international connections and logging in. I think we did pretty good here today, maintaining our discussion. As I mentioned before, we've never done a virtual panel. We usually just do a straight presentation with one presenter. So thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for all of your questions. My sincere apologies to those folks who posed questions that I was not able to get to. The number of questions here was indicative of how monumental and how important this transformation looks to be potentially in Mexico. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Alexis Arthur for all the behind-the-scenes effort to keep folks plugged in and logged in. And thank you all for participating. We will get a recording of this out to you tomorrow, and we'll be in touch with further details about the 2014 calendar for the Institute of the Americas Energy Program. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.